Anybody? It's one of the pieces. Remember, we have the continuum. We've got the grounds, a line, the claim. In the middle, we've got warrants. How would you describe the grounds of an argument? Go ahead, Margaret.
Foundational evidence.
Right, the basic foundational evidence, the data or the pure facts that you're using as the starting point for your argument. What is the claim? Brief review here. The thing you're trying to prove, exactly. And then the tricky one, what is the warrant?
It's assumptions that link the ground to the claim.
Exactly. So the assumptions or the steps in logic that get you from the evidence contained in the grounds, carrying us over to the claim. So we did the example of the toothpaste last week. Well, we talked about the barking dogs, and then we did the example of the toothpaste. Let's do it with a couple of the passages that we had in the sheets now. And I will fully admit, these aren't as clean cut as some of the other examples might be, so it might take a little bit of creativity sometimes to say what is the claim, what are the grounds of that claim. But are we able to kind of fit some of these statements into a similar model? I just thought it would be curious to try to do this as an exercise. So John 14, verses 6 through 7 is the first passage we want to do this with. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So I think it's typically easiest to start with the claim. What is Jesus' claim in this argument?
The way and the truth.
I am the way. I think you could say there might be a couple of parallel claims that Jesus is making in this statement. Maybe
You've seen the Father.
if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Well, if you know to know the Father, you just have to know me.
So to know the Father, you have to know me. What would you say is the end conclusion that Jesus wants them to draw through that statement?
He and the Father are one.
I and the Father are one. I would say so. Okay? Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. What do we want to call, whoops, I don't know what I did there. What do we want to call the grounds of this argument, and what do we want to call the warrant for Jesus' claim? And full disclosure, I haven't crafted an answer key, so I'm working on this live with you all too. This is an open discussion as far as what we think, and maybe we determine that the Tolman model doesn't really work for this statement very well. That's possible.
You need to know Jesus.
Okay, one needs to know Jesus.
They want to know the Father.
They want to know the Father. I feel as though, sorry, I'm thinking in real time here. I mean, the essential facts, the things that they know, they have seen Christ, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is an essential fact of the statement, an essential truth. And I and the Father are one. I mean, the assumption or the claim, the connecting thing between that ground and that claim is that Jesus has the traits of the Father. To know Jesus is to know the Father. It's kind of the same thing as the claim.
Yeah, they've seen him. They know his character. I mean, they see how he fulfills prophecy. They see how he is the embodiment of the things that he preaches and teaches. So they've seen his character is another fact. I think the warrant is that he assumes, and he uses Father here as a reference to God the Father. And I think the warrant is that there's the assumption that they want to know, they truly want to know God. His point is, when you've seen me, you've seen him. So that's the claim. I mean, if you know me the way you're supposed to, then you already know God in the fullest sense of that truth. So
I think you're helping me to see a little better where I'm going wrong here. I think Jesus' character being like that of the Father is not necessarily an assumption, but it's more so a part of the grounds. It's backing for the grounds that they have seen Christ. Jesus' character is like that of the Father. The assumption Jesus makes, and I think Bryce put it well, is they want to know God, and the conclusion he wants them to draw is that I am the way to know God, and I am the Father are one. Any other thoughts on this one? Sorry, that was kind of a clunky example, but sometimes it's good to push ourselves a little bit and see if we can parcel some of these things out. Any questions or other thoughts, disagreements? I'm open to that. Okay. Let's look at the next example here. 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 19. This one has some if-then statements in it. I'll just read it. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. Okay. Oops. So what do we think from this verse, or these verses? What are the claims that Paul is trying to persuade the Christians of in this passage?
There is a resurrection.
Okay? That there is a resurrection. What are some of the grounds or foundational facts that he lays out? In this example, he mostly argues from the position of a presumed negative. So you could kind of take the inverse of some of these negative things that he states. But what would you say forms the grounds or the foundations of his argument here?
Christ was raised from the dead.
Okay, Christ has been raised from the dead. I'm going to modify the claim a little bit here. There is a resurrection for Christians. So, Christ has been raised from the dead. How do we connect what assumptions are made? And they might be explicitly stated, they might not. What assumptions lead us from the fact that Christ has been raised from the dead to there is a resurrection for all Christians? I mean, God could have just raised Christ from the dead, right? So why do we have confidence that it applies to us too?
One of the warrants is that the power to raise from the dead exists, and Christ is an example. That is not to your question of are we also raised, but it does suggest that at least the authority and power to do so exists.
I don't know that it's explicitly stated here, but it's at least implied in the argumentation Paul's making, and is explicitly stated elsewhere, that Christians will be raised from the dead. So God has made a promise, is an assumption, that these people ought to have laid hold of. And Paul certainly has. God has promised the resurrection for the dead in general, not just Christ himself.
Right. Also in this example of 1 Corinthians 15, I think Paul provides, we mentioned earlier, one of the other portions you might see in these arguments is a presumed rebuttal, or you might state what would be a counter to this argument that would make it untrue. And Paul gives that here in this passage. What's Paul's rebuttal that he acknowledges? So if we go back to our standard model, the rebuttal is an acknowledgement of another view of the situation, or another valid argument that might be counter to one's own argument. What does Paul acknowledge here that would undo this argument if true?
If the dead do not rise, then Christ is not risen.
Can you say that again?
If the dead do not rise, then Christ is not risen.
Okay. He makes that statement in verse 16. If the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. He also makes the statement in verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching and your faith is in vain. So there's kind of a couple of premises there that if these are all true, then it undoes the thing that I'm trying to persuade you of. If no resurrection, then Christ not raised, and faith is in vain. Okay. I just, in writing that, thought you could almost rephrase this or rearrange this whole argument as the claim is your faith is not in vain, and the premises of that claim would be there is a resurrection from the dead. Therefore, Christ is raised from the dead because there is a resurrection. And therefore, because Christ is raised from the dead, our faith has substance, our faith has meaning. That's another way you could rearrange this. These kinds of answers aren't necessarily fixed in stone, and this is what you'll find in having these kind of discussions is sometimes you can rearrange or kind of reorder someone's arguments, and it can become clear what they're trying to argue, or maybe something that they weren't trying to argue makes more sense. It's just I think it's a good experiment to try to break things up like this. Okay, how are we doing on time? That's our toothpaste example. I had a couple more. Okay, so these are some non-scriptural ones. I'll admit, the passages were kind of tough. Trying to put those into the much. I'm shoehorning it in here a little bit, but I appreciate the participation. Here's one that's more of a hypothetical argument, not a biblical one. Okay, so the statement here, automatic weapons should be illegal. They enable their user to kill many people in a very short amount of time. This is because of the rate of fire they achieve when the trigger is held down. Okay, so the claim here is stated outright at the very beginning. Sometimes the claim is the first thing that gets stated. Automatic weapons should be illegal. What is our grounds stated in this argument here? Okay, that's a piece of it. I think there's something even more foundational that forms the grounds for that claim. The nature of automatic weapons, it's just a simple fact that if you hold down the trigger, they shoot very rapidly. So that's our grounds there. High rate of fire. So, therefore, allowing killing many people. Are there any unstated assumptions being presented here? I can think of a couple.
It would be beneficial to not have them.
So maybe branching off of the killing of many people, that is something to be avoided? Would you say, is that what you're trying to say, or are you trying to say something different?
Well, if they're made illegal, it would be beneficial for people to not have automatic weapons.
because of the retribution if they break the law?
No, because if you don't have, the reason they want them illegal is so people wouldn't have them. Society would be better off without automatic weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an assumption that if you make it a law,
People will.
somehow it's going to improve the fatality rate among humans.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying now. Thank you. So the act of making, we're assuming the act of making illegal will decrease the quantity of automatic weapons in people's possession.
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's a fair assumption to say that the killing of many people is something to be avoided. The assumption making something illegal,
Improves mortality.
makes it scarce.
I think there's one other argument, and that is that the risk lies in the weapon, not in the user. There's an assumption that guns kill people, people don't kill people. For those who would raise a counter argument, is that I could use a baseball bat or a BB gun if I was knowledgeable about how to kill people. I think there's an unstated warrant here that it's the weapon itself that is inherently dangerous rather than the user is the one creating the danger.
Because the argument I always hear is the criminal is not going to obey the law. Even if you make it illegal, they're going to find some way, whether it be with a baseball bat or an automatic weapon or,
So I think both of those statements are statements that I too have heard before. I don't think those are part of the argument that we're dissecting here, but those are rather, I would classify those as potential rebuttals that someone would try to offer to this argument.
Could we make also an assumption that you're talking about private citizens versus an agent or an army or a whatever of the government? Because we want our soldiers to be able to kill a lot of people in a short amount of time.
Or
Our
we assume we want them to be able to.
I mean, we want our soldiers to be able to fire at a high rate so they can defend us. But
I understand the points that are being made here. What I'm trying to help us to see a little bit is if we can what am I trying to say? We're trying to learn how to separate just seeing the steps that make one argument make sense or one argument stand versus the potential things that we would say counter to that. If there's an argument presented that we disagree with, it's very easy to start immediately thinking of the points that we would disagree with before we've really finished the process of just describing the argument as it's been presented. I think we're pretty much done as far as describing this argument as it's been presented. We know that automatic weapons have a high rate of fire. The assumption leading to the conclusion is that a high rate of fire makes the weapon able to kill many people, and if we were to make it illegal, that we assume that would make it more scarce. And that, I think, is the chain of reasoning that leads to the claim we should illegalize these weapons. The points of we don't know who's using the weapon, we don't know the intent of the person with the weapon, those are all things that are true and valid rebuttals and probably will merit continuing on this discussion. But if we were only trying to diagram and look at what was said just in this statement, I think that's basically it, unless anyone has any other assumptions that they can see here. I guess one other assumption, maybe a qualifier on the grounds. High rate of fire, as long as the gun still has ammunition and the trigger is still being held down. So there's kind of a use case of, if it runs out of ammo or the person lets go, that can change the grounds of how the weapon operates. So I think those counterpoints are valid, but we just have to see, do we see how those are rebuttals rather than being pieces of just this argument, going from grounds to claim? Maybe. Okay. Another example here. This is Mr. Dawkins again. This is from his book. I paraphrase this a little bit to try to fit it into a brief paragraph. He says, imagine a world without religion. In a picture of the Manhattan skyline, the Twin Towers are conspicuously present. Imagine, as John Lennon did, a world without religion, no 9/11, no crusades, no witch hunts. So that's Richard Dawkins. What is the claim that he's trying to make in this statement?
All religion is bad.
Religion is bad?
All religion.
All religion is bad? Maybe getting a little more specific than just bad.
All bad things, many bad things happen because of religious fervor, I don't know what you want to call it.
I'm just going to say all religion leads to tragedy / violence. Maybe it's backwards. Maybe what he's saying is these acts of tragedy and violence are because of religion. They are caused by religion. So now we get to the grounds, and he does not state grounds. I'm just going to tell you outright. So we kind of have to imagine a little bit. What would you imagine are the grounds for that argument? Maybe we'll just stick to 9/11, since that's mainly what he talks about in the argument. Were you going to say something?
The Twin Towers was an act of religious zealousness.
9/11 terrorists
Or religiously motivated.
were Muslim extremists. I think that's right. Okay. Now, what would you say is a pretty key assumption going from the terrorists who perpetrated 9/11 were Muslim extremists or religious extremists to these acts of violence, these tragedies? I mean, what he's really saying is would not have happened if not for religion. How do we get from those grounds to that claim? What's the assumption?
All religions will lead to this. I know that's what we have, that all religions teach some sort of fanaticism.
What about that most of or maybe he would just say many of the atrocities committed against humankind have been committed by religious groups in the name of their religion. I know that's not a very concise statement. I don't want to put words in his mouth by saying most, but I think he would suggest many.
Many atrocities committed by religion. Your statement, Dan, was that by extension all religion leads to these kind of acts of violence. I feel like that's probably, if one was to continue this argument, I feel like that would be the next step from this claim. Is the next thing I want to persuade you of is if the 9/11 terrorists were religious extremists, then any kind of religious extremist can lead to any of these kind of acts of terror. And he does that by hearkening to the Crusades, the witch hunts. He actually, I paraphrased it down, he lists like 10 different things. Some of them were events that I had never even heard of. But I think there's one other, whoa, wow, I spell check and it made a completely new word. I'll just leave it like that. One other thing that I thought was an unstated assumption here is no other motive. Because I think if you look at history, you'll see that yes, there's religious extremism, but many acts of violence against nations are also motivated by a whole different host of things. Osama bin Laden didn't like the U.S. not just because they weren't Muslim, but he had a lot of other things that he didn't like about the United States. Yes?
Could it also be an underlying assumption that all religious people are fanatical? I mean, based on the statement that he makes, I mean, he assumes that there are not only Muslim extremists, but there are Christian extremists, and perhaps based on what you said about the others in the list, other religious groups of which there are extremists, and so all of us are fanatical and therefore capable of such violence against humanity.
Would you agree with they were acting as if the whole religion would act?
It seems to be the basis of his statement or his claim.
I think that certainly is an assumption that he's leaving in here, which is their actions are indicative of the actions any kind of religious person would take given that he is claiming religion leads to these kinds of acts.
I think to say the same thing in another way is that all religious people are fanatical. For you to accept the unseeable God in the sky proves that you have a fanatic commitment to religion. There can be no halfway, I guess, is what I would say.
He might claim that. I mean, I can also see a scenario where if we're saying that's his assumption, if I was Richard Dawkins, I would come back and say, absolutely not. You know, of course there are Christians who are not fanatics. Of course there are Muslims who are not fanatics. But the very existence of the religion leads to the very existence of fanatics. So the negative actions of some are enough to say that the religion is the cause of these atrocities. I imagine could be a claim that he would make.
Well, not all fanatics act on their fanaticism either.
That is also true. Okay. Oh, good job on this one. I thought we broke that one apart pretty well. And this also goes to show, because, you know, this, in his book, this isn't presented as, okay, here's argument number one, and he starts. This is just prose. He's just writing, you know, and, but you can find in statements people make things that you can pull out and say, okay, this is one package, this is one argument, this is another argument. You can start to parcel these things out. Okay, I think we're done with Tolman model for a little while. I want to go on to talking about, I think the next thing on the sheet was a quick word about rebuttals. We've heard a couple of rebuttals already this evening, and there's a structure for rebuttals that I think makes a lot of sense when trying to counter something that you hear. And that is, they said, they failed to say, we say, and here's the reason. And so if you can remember kind of those steps, that comes in very handy when trying to address and refute and give a rebuttal for an argument. So the first step, you know, they said or you said, it's important to be able to summarize what you heard the other person say and do it in an honest and in a ethical way, not bending their words. It's good to get confirmation from them. Is this what you said? And then from that point, you know, what you failed to show or what they failed to show was this. So that's where you would start going into what were some of the unstated assumptions that we've been practicing identifying. If you can point out, well, this assumption was unstated, this thing that you didn't say, this is necessary in order for that conclusion to be true. Start pointing to the unstated premises that weren't given by the individual. Step 3 is, you know, we say or I say, you know, give now what is your position? What is your argument that you're trying to persuade them of? And then the reasons and the reasoning for that argument in step 4. Were those the 4 steps? Did I get it right? I don't have the sheet in front of me. I got to get better at that. Did I leave anything out, Brace?
No,
Okay.
I think that's it.
So, I was going to see if maybe we would practice doing this a little bit with some of these examples, but I want to get to fallacies because they're fun, and we've got to wrap this up so that we can start talking about other stuff. So let's go on to thinking about fallacies a little bit. Fallacies are errors in reasoning. They are common. They may appear to be legitimate, but they are either irrelevant, or they lack evidence, or they are not logically sound. Sometimes a statement is just wrong, and it's not necessarily a fallacy, it's just an incorrect statement. So it's important to distinguish the difference between those two. I've got 2 things here. Number 1, if you go outside without a coat, you'll catch a cold. Number 2, if you go outside without a coat, you'll catch a cold and you'll infect the rest of the family, and then your sister's going to have to miss class, and then she's going to get a bad grade, and she's going to fail her course. Okay? One of these is just wrong. If you go outside without a coat, you will catch a cold. That's just a factually untrue statement. You catch a cold by contacting the cold virus. Either someone gives it to you, you get it from some source. It's not because you went outside without a coat. That's not a fallacy, it's just not true. The second one is a fallacy. Why? Because it's making a series of logical steps. This is one called the slippery slope fallacy, where by a series of steps you're assuming some catastrophic end conclusion from a relatively benign starting point. So one statement is just factually incorrect. The other one attempts to employ fallacious reasoning, in this case slippery slope. So I made these handouts for your reference, and I just wanted to go through these real quick, and then we're going to play a game of Name That Fallacy. So the slippery slope is the one we just saw. That's where your conclusions are based on series of premises, each dependent on the preceding premise, and through a series of little steps, you eventually get to an extreme final result. So another example would be, if we legalize gay marriage, then the next thing you know, people are going to be allowing other people to marry their parents, or marry their cars, or marry monkeys. So it's a snowballing series of claims there. You can see how it gets the name slippery slope. The genetic fallacy. Something is judged to be either good or bad based on where it comes from or who originated it. So it shifts the focus on, we're talking about the merits of the thing being evaluated, to people's perceptions about its origins. So we're no longer talking about why the thing itself deserves or lacks merit. Example. So after being accused of accepting bribes on the 6 o'clock news, the senator made a statement that people shouldn't believe what they hear in the media because we all know how unreliable the media can be. Okay, so why is that a fallacy? Well, because he didn't say anything about whether the bribes were true or not. He didn't give any reason to believe that that's not the case. He just said, oh, well, this came from the media, so you can't trust it, right? So this is not addressing the point being made. Whoops. It's not addressing the point being made. It's diverting to, well, I'm going to talk about where it came from. Hasty generalization. A conclusion based on insufficient evidence. Rushing to a conclusion based on limited or few examples. So you might hear someone say, it's only been one day and I already know that I'm not going to enjoy this class. You know, you're basing that conclusion on one day of class. You have not enough information, not enough data yet to make that statement, but you hear people say that all the time. I remember hearing people say that all the time in school. This one's fun to say. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, if I can get it out. That's Latin for after this, therefore resulting from it. So it's the assumption that a sequential series of events implies a causal relationship. I drank a bottle of water and then later in the day I felt sick, so the water must have made me sick. That's an example of this kind of failed reasoning. There could be all kinds of other reasons why you're sick, and the cause of something, well, I was about to say something and I don't think that's true. I was about to say the cause of something doesn't have to necessarily precede it, but I'm pretty sure that's the way time works, so I'm not going to make that statement. Circular reasoning. The argument attempting to be proven is restated as evidence used to prove it. So this one's kind of sneaky because sometimes we don't really realize when this one's happening. Lewis Hamilton's a great race car driver because he wins so many races. Well, that's what a great race car driver does. That's what a great race car driver is. We're not really talking about his technique or his story or what he overcame, to get where he is now. We're just saying he's great because he's great, right? That's essentially what the argument boils down to there. And I always remember back in the days when I did debate, I know my coach always told me, circular reasoning will earn you a circular score. You will get a 0. All right, the either-or fallacy. This is sometimes called false dilemma, claiming there are only two options. They are usually extremes of each other to choose from, and it fails to acknowledge that other options can exist. We either stop driving cars or we will destroy the planet. That's a false dilemma, either-or situation.
You're saved by faith or saved by works.
You are saved by faith or you're saved by works. That's one that takes a little more explaining, but that's another one there. Ad hominem. This is one that a lot of people have probably heard of. This is a very common one. This one you hear all the time in political debates and campaign ads. You get those ads and it's like, Nancy Pelosi's a traitor to the nation because she blah, blah. That's an ad hominem attack. You're attacking the character or the personal traits of an opponent rather than addressing their arguments in order to undermine their arguments. So if someone says, well, why would I take marriage advice from someone who's been divorced 2 times? That's an example of an ad hominem attack. You're pointing to a trait of that person to invalidate what they're saying. You're not paying any attention to whether what they said is true or not. Bandwagon appeal, sometimes called appeal to majority. Appealing to the popularity of an idea or the fact that many people agree as a form of validation. The logical flaw is that the popularity of something does not have any bearing on its validity. You might hear someone say, it's okay to use AI tools to write your paper because everyone is doing it. Or you might hear someone say, if you're a real American, then you would support the right of people to drive whatever kind of car they want. So, the second one's a little subtle because it's not really saying it's a majority. What they're saying is you're out of the group if you don't have this mentality. It's an appeal to be within the group. And the source I was looking at said the bandwagon fallacy is incredibly popular among two groups of people. I'm trying to remember what the first one was. The second one was teenagers. Teenagers very commonly care very much about what everybody else is doing. And I think political parties was the other one. But anyway, a couple more. And by the way, if you Google lists of fallacies, I found an article where there were about 150. Some of these have names that I don't think they really deserve a name of their own. These are kind of the big ones that I could remember. Red herring is attempting to shift the focus of the argument at hand by introducing an irrelevant point. This one gets its name because supposedly the story I've heard on this is when they train bloodhounds to track people down, they test the bloodhounds by dragging red herring, which is a smelly type of fish, across the path of the scent that they want them to follow. So it's a distraction. It's something irrelevant that they're trying to distract the dog with. My opponent wants to introduce free health care, but what about all the homeless veterans in this country? That's a red herring argument because, well, okay, what about all the homeless veterans in the country? We're talking about free health care right now. It's an irrelevant point to what's being made. A lot of what about statements are red herrings. And finally, straw man, misrepresenting or oversimplifying someone's argument to make it easier to attack. So you dumb down what they're saying, and then you attack the dumbed down version instead of what they actually said. People who don't support increasing minimum wage just hate poor people. So that's taking the argument of not supporting the minimum wage, reducing it down just to, well, they're just doing it because they hate the poor, when in reality there's probably other reasons why they have that position, and you're not addressing those, you're just attacking the one that's easiest to attack. What you'll find about fallacies is they happen a lot when you're fighting. They happen a lot when you are mad or when you are emotional. And when you can step back and look at it later, you go, wow, I shouldn't have said that. All right, so lightning round. We've got a few minutes left. Name that fallacy. I'm going to read them out loud just for everyone's benefit. A politician is campaigning for road safety in an area with bad traffic accidents. However, the voters find out he has lied in previous campaigns, so they decide that this campaign is a bad idea. Just yell it out if you got it. Maybe keep score for yourself. See how many you can get. This is why I gave you all cheat sheets, because I went through that really fast. Ad hominem, right? We don't care what they say, we just don't like their characteristics. I'm not going to spell the rest of that. Okay, free health care is, if free health care is given to everyone, then eventually the government will need to give everyone housing and food and debt relief and everything. Eventually everyone will stop working and society will collapse. This one's pretty straightforward. What do we think? Slippery slope, right? You've got to prove all the steps that you're trying to get to before you get to societal collapse. It takes a little more work than just that. Okay, I can't give you a raise, but the company offers the most competitive benefits package in the industry. Red herring, yep. I'm not asking about the benefits package. I'm asking about a raise. And you're just changing the subject to not have to talk about it. Okay, a couple are arguing. One couple says, you never do the dishes. And the other one says, well, what about you? You never take out the trash.
Genetic balancing also.
Sorry.
Circular reasoning?
No, I wouldn't say that one. Remember which one depends on whatabouts. Whataboutisms.
Would be the red herring.
That is a red herring. You're right. I tricked you all because I did it twice. Winston Churchill was a great communicator because of how well he used the English language.
That's circular reasoning.
Yeah, this one's circular reasoning. You're basically restating the same thing twice as the reason why it's true. The only pit bulls that I've ever seen were dangerous and violent. I don't think people should keep them as pets.
Hasty generalization.
Absolutely.
Jumping to conclusions.
What was that?
What did Bruce say?
Oh, this one's a hasty generalization. So you only know a few facts, you only know a few examples of pit bulls, and you're making a conclusion about all of them. What do you know about paying taxes? You don't even have a job. Either or? Not that one. Ad hominem. This is another attack. By the way, ad hominem, it means to the man. It's an argument that is, I'm going to point at characteristics or traits that you have. This one's a real quote. George W. Bush in 2001 said, "You are either with us or against us in the fight against terror." This one's pretty simple. This is an either or fallacy. Oh, we're having so much fun. Charlie, I think we should put more money into our schools. Quality public education is important. Wendy says, so you're saying we should cut our military spending to buy crayons and notebooks? I guess you want our country to be weak and defenseless target for terrorists.
Straw man?
That's a straw man, yes. So she reframed his argument as something he didn't say, and she attacked that because it was easier to attack than the thing that he said. Here's one for...
You skipped over the one before that.
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure why you did, but after I read that, maybe, maybe I see why you skipped over it.
It was not intentional, so you get to answer this one, Susan. Growing up, none of my brothers or my dad would ever clean up around the house. Men are useless when it comes to doing chores. So what do we say there?
Just a statement of truth, isn't it?
I guess that would be a hasty generalization.
Yep.
I can offer another one in answering the question.
Yeah, just because your brothers and your dad didn't clean up around the house doesn't mean all men can't do chores. I like that.
And my husband's not.
Is this the rest? Or, oh no, I've got a bunch more of these. Okay. I'm having so much fun. Let's see. Well, you want to finish the rest on Sunday? We'll do it real quick, maybe before we get into lesson 1. I promise we will do lesson 1 on Sunday. So be thinking about the natural universe, the cosmos, and arguments for God that begin from nature and from the physical realm. So thank you all for your participation this evening, and we will get into other material as we go on. So thank you.